Hello everybody, and welcome to the Healing Power of Nature in Grief, part of the Good Grief Festival. My name is Dr. Liesl Dawson, and I'm a senior lecturer in the University of Bristol, specialising in English literature and the history of psychology. In her book, Silent Spring, the environmentalist Rachel Carson observed, there is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature. The therapeutic benefits of nature have been recently backed up by scientific studies that suggest that time spent in the natural world can boost the immune system, alleviate depression, and lower stress. In this session, we'll be hearing from panelists about how an engagement with nature helped them to manage and process their grief. I'm really delighted to be joined by three authors whose books give us insight into the way nature can distract and heal. Christopher Somerville has spent more than 25 years walking and writing. He's the author of over 40 books. These include the phenomenally successful Coast series and January Man, A Year of Walking Britain, in which he takes walks that continually bring to mind his father. Long Litt Woon is an anthropologist based in Oslo. Her book, The Way Through the Woods of Mushrooms and Mourning, describes how mushroom picking helped her with her grief after the death of her husband. And I've also just seen that her book is on the shortlist for Warwick's Prize for Women in Translation, so that's really good news. Sarah Jane Douglas is an artist and writer. She's a lover of mountain climbing, and she's the author of Just Another Mountain, a memoir of hope, written after the death of her mother. It details the personal and physical challenges she faced after turning to climbing as a coping mechanism for her grief. So I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you so much for coming today. And I want to start this session really by asking each of our panelists to say a little bit more about their story, about their book, and how nature operated in their own grief process. Christopher, is it okay if I start with you?
Yes. Well, my book is called The January Man. It's actually named after a song by Dave Goulder, beautiful song, which talks about the cycle of the seasons and the cycle of a man's life. I first heard it in a smoky folk club in about 1980, sung by somebody called Martin Carthy, who some of you may know. He's a great singer, and it stuck in my mind very strongly. It's a poetic expression of the turning year, and when I came to decide I wanted to write a book about the seasons in Britain, I hung it on the peg of The January Man. So I had a chapter for each month, and I've tried to find a walk which was characteristic of that month. So snow in February and the falling leaves in September. While I was writing the book, it was 10 years since my father had died, and I realized that I hadn't grieved for him at all, in the sense that I didn't even know what grief really was. I was expecting, if I thought about it, I was expecting perhaps a sort of howling, screaming, crying, carpet chewing misery, recurring terrible feelings and feelings of desolation and despair and abandonment, I suppose. But actually, I didn't feel any of that at all. I felt a sense of relief, and a sense of let's just carry on as much as possible. And it was only 10 years after he died, and in the course of writing The January Man, that I began to think about him and realized that the walks that he and I had taken year by year, the long walks, a week or two each, had been they'd helped us to get closer together, But it was only writing the book and processing what I'd thought about him and the walks that we'd done made me realize what kind of a man he was and got me to appreciate him and the loving person that he was. He was a product of his generation tremendously. He was born in 1917. He went to Dartmouth Naval College. He served in the Mediterranean during the war and never spoke a word about it, like so many of that generation. He worked for GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters in Cheltenham, a top secret job, never spoke a word about that either. So in the 1950s, a person like that, for a naughty little boy like I was, set the moral bar extremely high. We all thought our parents were, the greatest things since sliced bread and absolutely moral arbiters, and could never reach that height. And I think it made a lot of us feel a bit more naughty than we were, perhaps, and made it very hard to get through on a personal level to fathers and sons particularly, for those reasons. He didn't open up, and I didn't know how to make him open up. And I realized that when we were walking together, from the age of about 25 onwards, in my case, when you walk, you're not face to face all the time in a sort of aggressive pose. You're side by side and walking and talking outwards. So it's very easy to express yourself because you're not eyeballing each other all the time. And that was very helpful to realize that. He loved walking, he loved being in nature, and so did I. And so this was something we had in common. But it was only retracing those steps, writing this book and contemplating my father and thinking about his life and his secretiveness and his tremendous love, his active, practical love for us, which never really found expression in sort of kisses and cuddles and so on, that helped me to appreciate him. So my experience of grief, if it was grief, and is grief, was a very, very long drawn out one, and quite profound, but in a sort of not in a dramatic way. So it's a curious thing. But I know that if I hadn't written this book, taken these journeys, I would never have come to appreciate him as I do now.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, it's almost as if the journeys are allowing you to start the grieving process and sort of begin that. Yes. We've got more to say, but I'd like to now turn to Woon. And Woon, could you share your story?
Yes, thank you very much. I wrote this book after my husband died very suddenly. And it started off as a book about mushrooms because I started mushrooming after he died, and this whole new world opened itself up to me. And when I was telling my friends about this, my new hobby, they thought I had a lot of stuff to tell. So I thought, maybe I could write a sort of like a quirky and very personal type of book about mushrooms. But in my mind, mushrooms and mourning were very much connected. But I didn't know at that time when I was writing this first draft how to include my husband into the book. And I struggled with it for a while, and at one point, wondered if I should write a line or two, in the preface about, how this whole thing came about. However, when I started writing about him, not about him, but about the loss of him, I realized then that this book has two stories. And so there's an outer journey, my discovery of this kingdom of fungi, and also of the mushroom people, because I'm an anthropologist and I can't help myself. So I met, this strange tribe in the forest. I had to talk about them. And then there's this inner journey in this landscape of grief. So the book, The Way Through the Woods, is about these two journeys and how they are intertwined.
Lovely. That's great. Thank you. Sarah, would you like to share your story now?
Yeah, sure. So I was always encouraged to keep a diary from a very young age. My mother, she bought me my first one, and she told me just I could put all my thoughts and my feelings in there, or what had happened in my day. And one day I did actually say to her, what am I meant to do with all of these diaries? And she said, you never know, you might write a book one day. It was a throwaway remark that actually ended up coming true. I Diaries are like a therapy.
Ooh, I think.
And as much as paintings, I'm an artist as well. And when I lost my mother to cancer, I was aged 24. She was only a young woman herself, aged 44. And it was really hard for me to come to terms with her loss. My life took quite a destructive path. I made a lot of bad choices for myself. I really struggled. I actually think the grieving process began before she had her secondary diagnosis of cancer, because we knew that she wasn't going to survive. So the grieving process already began. And I kind of felt cheated, in a way, because I was so young and I felt I hadn't really got to know who my mother was. There was always this kind of emotional distance between the two of us, which I was always trying to bridge that gap, trying to understand, trying to find a way in to be closer emotionally to her. And Mum loved walking, and I would go with her, and we would, walk the beach, walk the river. We would, go further afield and walk along the sea cliffs where there was wild goats roaming around. And that time was precious. It was our time to talk. And as I said, my time to try and work my way in there and build that relationship that I really craved to have with her. So, so writing the book for me was actually a personal project. I never really had any grand plans for it being published or anything like that. But I was aware from the start that it would be a story I would like to pass down to my two sons, because they never had the privilege of knowing my mother the same way that I had benefited from the positive relationship that I had had from my maternal grandparents, and it was their history, it's our history, and I wanted them to learn who their family was and where they're from. And when up here in the Highlands, there's a thing called Expo North. So you can approach these people, they get European funding, and they edit your work, and they're open to the arts and crafts as well as writers and musicians and stuff. So I went along and I saw this guy, and I thought, yeah, this will be great. He'll edit the book, check the spelling, check the grammar, it'll be fab. I'll have this finished product. I won't need to do much more. Pass it down to the kids, that's it. But the next thing I knew, I had an email from Jenny Brown, who's one of the best literary agents in the whole of the UK, and she wanted to meet me. And she said that she felt that my story was really interesting, and that it would be something that other people would maybe like to read. And it's just a sharing thing, and my head swelled. I was absolutely flattered. I kind of just rolled with the whole thing. Didn't really think that all these family secrets were going to be out there for public scrutiny. But it's done now. It's a done deal. It's too late. It's out there. So yeah.
Thank you. So one of the things I was really struck by in reading your three books is the way that it seems to me nature sort of does something in terms of grief and mourning, but that it works quite differently for the three of you. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. It seemed to me, Christopher, going back to those places, it was a way for you to almost conjure those memories. You talk in your book about the skull cinema, you know, the way that when you walk, it can kind of release these memories and thoughts like a sort of like a film going on. And clearly going back to those places that you'd gone to with your father was a way of kind of connecting with him in certain ways. Woon, I was really interested in the way that you felt yourself to be kind of anesthetized in your grief, you know, that you couldn't taste, you couldn't smell, and that, you know, kind of nature's doing something different you for there. And Sarah, again, I feel like there's the kind of wildness of the mountain, the challenge, and the connection with your mother. So, I mean, I'm kind of prompting you, but I guess I'd be quite interested to hear in a bit more detail, like, what is it about nature that was helpful? Like, what particular thing did it do for your grief? I don't mind who starts.
In what order?
Woon, what about, or, yeah.
Sure, I can start. Well, even though I'd lived in Norway for very many years, I was not a big hiker like all the rest of the Norwegians, you know. So for me, so it was the mushrooms which took me into the forest. So this was new territory for me. And that itself, you know, could be healing in many ways. But of course, you know, going into the woods and now we know how it, you know, works on our brain and how good it is for all of us. For me, well, it was the mushrooms, and the mushrooms are quiet, you know, they don't talk back to you. They just sit there and wait for you. And so that was fine for me, you know, because, you know, sometimes I could just go there with all, not alone, of course, because I was very afraid, but, you know, with my new friends, and I could just leave when I wanted. So there was no obligation. That was, you know, that was how it worked for me. But since you mentioned this thing about the senses, yes, when my husband died, I felt as though, you know, I was in a coma. I know I couldn't, I couldn't sort of really hear what other people were saying. You know, food didn't taste any good. You know, I felt as though all my senses were shut down. However, you know, when you go mushrooming and you know, one of the major things you do is to try to identify the mushrooms. And when you want to identify a mushroom, you really have to wake up. You really have to sharpen up. You know, you have to use all your senses, especially the sense of smell. And this was very difficult for me. I mean, because there's a technical jargon too that mushroomers use, just like, you know, wine lovers would talk about, you know, how the different aromas that they say they smell when they pick up a glass of wine. Mushroomers do the same thing too, and they have words for it, you know. So this was very difficult for me, but at the same time, it sort of it was important for me, and this whole awakening of not only the senses but also of myself, because I really had to pay attention and just be present.
Yeah, I like the way you describe mushroom picking, is that gathering mushrooms is both a tactile and sensory experience. With focus and fixity of purpose come joy and excitement. And I get the sense there that part of what you relished was, you know, actually being in the present moment, that it sort of stops these negative thoughts, obsessive thoughts about grief, that you could actually just be there and be kind of physically and sensually sort of present. Yeah, no, but it's described quite beautifully, I think. But that seems quite different to me from both what Sarah experiences and what Christopher experiences in terms of nature, kind of how it operates for them. Do either of you want to kind of come in there on that?
Sarah, do you want to?
I don't mind. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so at first, when as I said before, walking was something that my mother and I had always done together. So after her death, initially I felt, both a disconnection and connection to nature, to the walks that I was doing. I mean, I think I felt disconnected from everything, because this loss, this grief was just so huge and all encompassing. But to go out and to do the walks that we had shared together, it did bring me comfort. But I found myself, needing to go to higher places and wilder places. And, in the wilderness, I kind of found a refuge in the solitude of the mountains. And even though, they can be really wild and dangerous places, mountains became my safe place. I felt really secure when I was up over the heathers and the crags and along the ridges. And the mountains are amazing because some of them, lots of them in Scotland, you've got really long walks in, and they're the bits where your brain can kind of switch off. You're not concentrating on so much your route finding. And this is when my brain chatters incessantly, and it's going on and it's ruminating over the troubles of my past and the grief and problems. But then the mountain has the power to just cut that off completely, because then you become embroiled in your route, and you've got the map in front of you, and you have to pay real attention to where you're going. You've got to take bearings, you've got to know your stuff, and so it becomes, being on the mountain becomes a form of mindfulness. It really brings you into the present. You're living in the moment, and that's what's quite amazing about mountains. They can give you everything that you need. Time to ruminate, but also time to be completely present with yourself. Time to reflect and gain some real perspective on, your problems aren't really, or your everyday problems of life are kind of like minimized when you're up there and you're looking at all these amazing mountains around you, and you feel your insignificance. You're so small on this mound of earth that's been here for millions and billions of years. And the mountains themselves are, they wear away. Our Scottish mountains were once as high perhaps as the Himalayas, and time, just the gradual slow processes of time and weathering and glaciation and water making its way down, it's worn away our mountains, and everything goes back to dust. We all go back to dust. We're all, it's just, life is one great big cycle. That's what I think.
That's great. Christopher, what about you? Is there anything?
That's very, very eloquently put, and I share that thing that it gives you a proper sense of your own insignificance. That's very important. I find my experience of walking is completely different because I do it for a living. I write about it. So I'm there with a notebook, a camera, a map, a sat map, and a pen, and I'm sort of laden with these things, if you like. And I'm recording all the time I'm walking. So I might have a notebook. At the end of the walk, I'll have a book with 50 pages of scribbling, only identifiable by myself. And then I have to sort of craft that into a nice piece of writing. So my concentration is absolute all the way through. And I'm not really going, hello clouds, hello sky, what a sublime thing. But my wife comes with me, Jane. She notices all the things I don't. She's absolutely, we're yin and yang in that sense, totally. I see some things, she sees other things. She's relieved me of the burden of actually noticing that damn beetle that just went past. She'll notice it. She'll know quite a lot about it, and she'll say, "Hey, stop! Look at that thing." And that leaves me with more time to do, to look out and say, that is a fantastic array of sunshine there coming through that cloud with those sort of apocalyptic Blakean shafts spreading a kind of silver over that lovely plain down below. The words, those weren't very good words, they were a bit pretentious, but the words shape themselves as I'm going. And the words, in some cases, precede the emotion. Mm-hmm. So I'm finding the words and the emotions come very close together. My dad he seemed to me when I was a child like a very stern, upright, sensible, no-nonsense figure. In fact, I know he was one of the biggest romantics of all time. I now realise, deeply in love with nature and the feeling of mountains and the romance of it. And I didn't get that at all, but now I do. So that's wonderful.
Interesting. That's
I just also want to say that you look at, I'll find myself by a hedge and I'll stop and see a yellowhammer, who's been singing and draw my attention. And there'll be moments where I'll just think, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I'm seeing it now in real time, and it's sitting there, and it doesn't give a damn what I do or what my feelings are or what my emotions are. It's just going to go on doing its thing. And then I'll see the bird's eye primrose in Upper Teesdale in spring, and there's a bank of them, and they're going to go on growing there, no matter whether I'm walking past or not. And poor little Christopher, who's feeling this, that, and the other, they don't care. That's a very salutary, healthy, helpful thing.
Mm-hmm. It really strikes me. We've talked a lot over the last couple of days at the festival about the dual processing model of grief, which is the model whereby to process grief, you need to spend time both in sort of activities that focus on the grief, sitting with your grief, reminiscing, feeling the pain, but also you need moments, kind of restoration moments, where you're ignoring it, repressing it, getting on with your day, doing this and that. And it strikes me that what nature offers is almost the perfect sort of place to do both these activities, because you can release this, what you call the skull cinema, the kind of wave of images and memories and thoughts. And yet it also then pulls you back to the present tense, to the tactile, now, which allows you to escape that. So I think, there is something very strong about how I think nature operates. You mentioned a little bit the need for solitude, and I do wonder how strong that was. It sounds like, Christopher, you mostly go, from reading your book, you mostly have company. I know, Woon, you mentioned a need initially. You said you went into a kind of self-imposed exile. And I think, Sarah, from your book, I get the sense that there was a need for solitude quite strongly initially. And I just wonder if that sort of changed at all over the course of your grieving process. Woon, what about you?
This need for solitude, I think it was like, it was not just only solitude. I think I needed lots of things, but maybe I didn't know what I needed. But one, I didn't know what I needed. I couldn't articulate what I needed, and the other part of it is, of course, the people around me could not give me what I needed. People are very sort of uncomfortable, right, with grief, and want to just get on and want you to get on. So what the forests, the mushrooming society, which I joined, gave me was an alternative to all that, right? Yes, it was a space for restoration, but it was a space to become a new person, because people in the mushrooming society, at least in Oslo, are so mad about mushrooms. They only talk about mushrooms, so they didn't know me as a widow, you know. Whereas with my other group of friends, my I was this widow with a big W. There was this big empty space next to me. My husband was gone. Whereas in this mushrooming society, they didn't know me, so I had a chance to sort of try out this try out a new identity, as a mushroom lover, and of course it took me to new places, in this city which I'd lived for 40 years, and which I'd not been to, new forests, and it restored me the sense that there were lots of new ingredients for me to cook with, which I didn't know before. And but this thing that both Sarah and Christopher were talking about earlier, it's the thing about being present. That was very important for me, because that was how I got hooked on mushrooms. I mean, this feeling of joy when I thought I would never ever be happy again. I mean, so that feeling of joy that I felt for the first time, it just struck me as, in a very physical way. And that was how I got hooked.
Which is lovely.
And thank you. And when I tried to sort of describe this, try to hold on to this feeling.
She froze a bit.
It was just like I was in a bubble, and it was just me.
Slightly frozen, I think. Do you have the same, Sarah and Christopher? Is Woon slightly frozen? Yes.
Yes. Woon's frozen.
Yeah. Okay. She'll come back. There she's back. There we go. And your names have changed, but we know who you are, so that's okay because you've moved around. Sarah, I feel like there's an important bit of your story that we actually didn't get to when you talked about your book, about your mother and about your climbing, and kind of, the kind of pilgrimage that you went on with regards to her ashes and how that kind of fits into your story. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, and whether it led you to think differently about your role with your mother and yourself.
It's just that's so big. I'll be talking for about 3 hours, Lethal, if we go down this route. But I will try to be succinct as possible. So my mother was engaged to be married to one of the British Army's best climbers of the time back in 1975. His name was Jerry. And their marriage was to be in June 75, and he was off on expedition to Nuptse, which was kind of like a practice run for Everest the following year. And 6 weeks before their marriage, he was heading up into the summit Kolwar, when an accident happened. We'll never really know, but we think that it was a rock avalanche that swept Jerry and his climbing partner from the face of the mountain. They fell all the way from the top to the very bottom, and died, obviously instantly. And my mother was actually in Glasgow at the time buying her wedding shoes. So the police had to locate her and find her and let her know the news before it was broadcast on TV that night. So my mother had suffered this really tremendous loss. This man was the love of her life, and his loss devastated her. She barely spoke a word for about 6 months. She would take herself off on these long solitary walks. I was just a little girl at the time. I was only like about 2.5, and not even I was able to get through to her. And I actually think that was where that emotional distance began between us. She was very private, and she never really spoke about the feelings of grief that she carried. But I later learned, when I was, writing my book and I was researching her past as well. And I was going through all these calendars, and I noticed every single 9th of May was circled, and that was the day that he had died. So she never forgot about him and how important he was to her. And in fact, the last couple of days of her life, when she was taken up to the local hospital, she went off in the ambulance first, and I followed up. And when I got there, she basically sent me home straight away, and she said, "Could you go and fetch me the bangle that Jerry gave to me?" So, he was in her thoughts to the moment that she died. "This is the bangle. Can you see it? It's on my wrist." It's very special. And it's kind of like my way of keeping her close to me too now. So, that was for me when the penny kind of began to drop about who she was, and things about her life started to make sense. And I felt that I was actually beginning to understand who she was in her life. And I was able to then, accept both her life and her death. And that was what led me on my journey to the Himalayas. I'd held on to her ashes for like 15 odd years because I just couldn't bear to part with her. And I wasn't ever sure. I wasn't ever sure really what the right thing to do with those ashes would be. But she had always said to me that I would get there in the end. And I did. I figured, I did figure it all out. And it made sense to me to bring her to Jerry, where he still lay, because they couldn't recover his body from the Bergstrand. It would have put other people's lives at risk. So he remains there. So it was my job, I felt, to take her to him and reunite them in their death.
I think it's an amazing story. It's a beautiful story. And when you read the whole book, it's a kind of crucial moment, I think, in terms of you understanding your relationship with her and feeling differently about your grief, And I think it's one thing I'm really moved by is the fact that you get to do this beautiful thing for her. And actually you get to help her in her grief. So there's a way in which you're comforting her, and doing this lovely action. And we talked in a different session, the Pilgriman session, about how much, you love someone, you want to kind of carry on doing kind things for them. And that we often don't get that opportunity in our culture to do kind acts for the dead whom we love still. But I was also really struck with you talking, there's a real reassessment of your mother and who she is, and that changes how you see your relationship. And I think, Christopher, you get a really strong sense of that from your book as well, that, you see your father differently, you see the entirety of his life. And actually that changes how you view the relationship you've had with him.
Oh, completely, yes. It's very striking. I got some of his old colleagues at GCHQ to open up. These were gentlemen who had and ladies who had signed the Official Secrets Act, and they were absolutely, sworn never to say a word about it. They were pretty uneasy about talking about it, but they realised the project I was on. It was so interesting to find out when I'd been a spotty, stroppy 15-year-old, reluctantly going on a walking holiday with him in the Lake District and sulking all the way, smoking a crafty embassy out of the bedroom window and this sort of thing. He was head of J, which meant that he was in charge of the Russian section at GCHQ, and he was basically, I don't say he was exactly fighting the commies on his own, but he was certainly heavily involved in the Cold War and in its effects. Of course, I didn't know that.
No.
So in a way, I now see it as a wonderful thing of him to do, to take time off from his own worries and anxieties and, put himself in a tiny Mini with his with his stroppy son and bother to take him walking. I have a much richer understanding of who my dad was now, and it's been extremely. It's not just been helpful; it's been fascinating too.
Yeah.
So when I look at a picture of him now with his side-parted hair and his neat face and his neat clothes and his neat tie and his shiny shoes, I know there was a passionate, romantic, and very anxious man underneath all that, and I would never have guessed it at the time.
No, that's really interesting. Woon, turning to you, one of the things I really love about your book is the kind of anthropological view of everything. And, you know, you're somebody who I know studies borders and immigrations. And so the fact that you love mushrooms seems so fascinating to me, because they're the great border crossers who are hard to categorize. And you do at different moments, you know, look with an anthropologist's eye on the mushroom community, but also sometimes at grief. You know, you describe grief as a kind of limbo, and you think about different practices. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your own insights, your kind of anthropological view of the world of mushrooms and the world of grief.
Well, you know, as an anthropologist, all anthropologists do field work, right? And when you do field work, you go into this unknown world, the world that is unknown to you, and you try to understand it on its, you know, on its own terms. And so that's what I'm trained to do. And however, when my husband suddenly died, and my life was just, my inner life was just all chaotic, I realized this only after, you know, in retrospect. I didn't know that was what I was doing. But what I did was I turned this anthropological training in my anthropological eye inwards into this chaotic new world that I was in, and tried to understand it on its own terms. And when we were doing field work, I remember, I mean, my professor telling me that, you know, when you do field work, you have to keep on getting out of your comfort zone. You have to speak to people you do not know. You have to go to places you have not been before, because when you're in this new strange world, it's very tempting to just stick to the 2-3 people who are nice to you and you know, talk to you. But basically, if you're doing your field work and trying to, you have to cast your net very wide, and you have to, as wide as possible, you know, to get the whole range of data that will maybe lead you somewhere. So in a way, that was what I did with my grief. I mean, I just went into it. I didn't. Yeah. I did not rest in a way. Until I was out of the woods.
Yeah. I do think the book contains a lot of really interesting kind of sociological insights about how grievers are treated, you know, and how they act. I've just been told that we have quite a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to read some of those out for us now. Okay, here's one. I have found walking in the places my husband wanted to be and can no longer be makes me feel so full of sadness. I struggle to find any solace. I would love to find a way to be able to remember the great times rather than the sadness for lost dreams. Any first suggestions?
That's a very poignant thing to say. I think that I like to make notes, either in my head or in a book, and contemplate what I'm learning about things. It takes me out of those negative thoughts, and makes me focus on the flower or the bird and so on. And then putting it together afterwards, contemplating the whole walk, all the things I've seen and learned. It's like going with a box of paints and a blank paper and coming back with a completed picture. That helps to see a wider prospect, I think.
Yes, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you always
Everybody's experience of grief is so unique. I mean, there are billions of us on the planet, and look how different we all look, you know. And it's the same for our experiences. My grief is different from the next person's, but I would say that you will get there in time, and it's just a question of, you know, not maybe patience, but you'll get there in the end.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose it's taking things in small steps, you know, that perhaps, you know, it's difficult because it's hard not to remember things that make you sad as well as make you happy. They kind of, in grief, they do come together. So it's hard to think you can completely avoid the sad bits, but perhaps being careful where one goes. We've had a question from Greg. All three speakers are talking about writing. How much of the healing provided by nature comes from putting your thoughts down in words?
Yeah, I can say a few words about that. I mean, people have asked me whether it has been therapeutic to write this book, and the short answer is yes. But I did not write. I did not think that was going to be. This was my therapy, but definitely trying to organize this chaos that I talked about, that I was feeling, and my way out of this chaos helped me create this new narrative. But the interesting thing for me is after the book has came out, you know, I've been around talking about my book and reading, and every time there'll be, you know, some new question, some comment, which would help me put my grief, pack it in a different way, give me a new insight, give me a new thought. So actually this therapeutic process for me is still continuing, even, you know, after my book has come out. So it has definitely worked for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I've been thinking of challenging myself to take hikes that my sister was planning to do. Have any of the speakers taken a walk on behalf of their deceased person? Well, I think Sarah certainly has. We heard her story already, really. Have others want to contribute to that? Taking a walk for the deceased person?
Well, the reason why I started on this mushrooming course was because this was something that my husband and I had talked about doing, never got around doing, you know. So So I definitely did it because we had thought about it before. Yeah.
And the same with me. I wanted to retrace, in some cases, retrace walks that we'd done, my father and myself, and sometimes, in some cases, new walks. But I'd say that he was with me all the time. It was very strange. I wasn't expecting that, but his presence perhaps was with me. And after I'd finished the book, I did have a strange experience of a month or two after he died, coming around the corner of the lane in which his house was, and seeing him outside his house, sort of in his terrible tatty old jacket, awful thing, and his baggy cords and his old man's boots and his old man's stick, sort of hunched over him, walking away up the lane. And it was only for a moment, but there was a definite, strong impression of the person, and gave me a little shock of what I suppose is grief. But it's hard. As I say, it's hard to say because my quality of grief is obviously completely different from the two of you. But it was a strange moment.
I think one of the things I love at the end of your book, Woon, is when you say, when I tell people I've lost my husband, they understand it to mean that he's died, but actually I'm looking for him everywhere in the physical world, you know, that he will be a presence to me. And there is something about these journeys and these pilgrimage, which is about making them present and finding their presence and looking for them. And I think a walk like that would be a really lovely way of doing that, really.
If I just add one thing, I saw a photograph of my father while I was writing his book, aged about 50, and he was sitting on a sofa with a huge, wide smile on his face. And he was with his sister, who he adored, and he was laughing riotously. I'm sure he'd had a few drinks. I saw that, and I thought, I don't know that man. I can't remember that man. That was a very sad moment. I literally, because of his, you know, the way he'd been in his last few years of his life, I had forgotten so far I couldn't even recognise that happy, relaxed, funny man that I saw in that picture. That was a jolt.
We also have some kind of stories and comments and shared things. We have the comment, my wife died in an accident in similar circumstances to that Sarah described. I think the fall that you described with Jerry. It changes the way you feel about such wild places. It was only recently in July, our favourite piece of countryside, the first day after lockdown. I was not with her. So that's terribly sad. And of course, you could totally understand how you would feel differently and frightened of, those kinds of wild places. But we're very sorry for you. We've also had some comments that I think just chime in about the healing power of nature. When we look to Mother Nature and how things come in cycles, it can make it easier to accept death as part of the life cycle. Nature can help us connect to and open up to dying and grief. So again, I think the January Man, the fact that you talk about the cycles of the season, that your book is about the seasons, but also about the death of your father, is kind of sort of making that point, I guess.
Yes, the last verse of that song goes, the January man comes round again in woolen coat and boots of leather to take another turn and walk along the icy road he knows so well. The January man is here for starting each and every year along the way forever. Wonderful, profound.
Good. We've also had a question. I'm currently working on a book that started as my own healing process. How can I find out whether it might be publishable? So what advice can you give as published authors?
Somebody else.
Send it out. Send it out. Have a go.
Try agent. Go try with an agent first.
Yeah.
Because they're definitely the most helpful if you want to really get your work published.
Yeah. You'll know then if it is publishable. And if all the agents turn up their noses at it, self-publish. Don't be frightened of doing that.
We also have some praise for your book, Long Litt Woon. I read your book 6 months ago. It planted a seed. I got into mushrooms this year, learning, foraging, magical. That moment of discovery, I forgot everything. Thank you for sharing. I feel I have discovered a lifelong hobby. So that's nice.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I also cook mushrooms in a whole new way now that I've read the book. Butter comes after. The book also has many good recipes, as well as, information about mushrooms, information about mourning. Okay. Let's see if there's any others. Yeah. And then again, things about the kind of wildness of nature, the ebb and flow, even the falling leaves are embraced and absorbed. I mean, lots of people coming back to the kind of cycle of nature. And, the sense that is important. Was that crucial for you in terms of the kind of healing process?
Well, definitely. For me, just learning about mushrooms and the whole cycle of mushrooms, the life of a mushroom, and how the death of a mushroom is, how important that is, not only for the nature around it, but actually for all of us, for life on Earth. Because they have such an important role to play, in decomposing all organic material. So without mushrooms, I mean, our planet would be just full of stuff that would take tons of time to decompose. We would not be able to live the way we do. So this cycle of life is very present, and part of it is, of course, death, and how important death is for this whole cycle. So that is very, present when you get into this world. Yeah.
And death re-emerging as life.
Yes.
After death feeding life.
Yes.
I learned about the yew tree and how the yew, when it's finally ready to die, it's hollow completely, and inside the yew, the new yew grows. And decomposing wood as it falls down builds a litter from which the new one grows. So you can have a yew which is 8,000 years old and has been through 20 or 30 cycles of life, but is still, in a way, the same yew tree.
Yeah.
It's quite a nice thing to contemplate.
Yes.
I think we're almost out of time. Before we finish, I wonder if there's any final comments. I had one final question for Woon, which was just about whether you had a sense, you know, culturally, having, you know, you're from Malaysia, you live in Norway, whether you have any insight to the different mourning practices and whether one seems to you to support healthier grieving practices.
Well, I grew up in Malaysia. In Malaysia, there are lots of rituals around this whole mourning, grieving process, you know, and it goes on for years. But definitely the first year, you know, you would have, like, at least among the Chinese, you would have, you know, the first 7 days, the second 7 days, this goes on for 7 weeks, so 49 days, and then you have the 100th day, and so on. So, and as a child, of course, you know, I didn't understand all this was, you know, I didn't understand the function of it. But definitely when my husband died, the function of these rituals became very clear to me, because basically these are public events, right? All your friends would know about it. People will come to the house. You don't have to talk about your grief because people know you are grieving. They know who the main person is, the one whom we're all missing. So however, in Norway, you know, like, okay, you know, everybody comes, you know, it's a very short and burst of attention you get, you know, but the minute the funeral is over and everybody has gone home, you know, the house is very, very quiet, you know. Yeah. And then after a while, the phone stops ringing and people are basically impatient. They want you to move on with your life, and I'm not ready to move on. You know, it takes time, even though grieving is very different for all of us, you know. And therefore, in my book, and I do not mention when my husband died, because I feel that is irrelevant in a way. It's just I wanted to talk about the loss and how I dealt with the loss. So I don't say when he died or what he died of, because but people, I wanted to give myself the whole, when I say the luxury of mourning, the luxury of grieving. I didn't want anybody to hurry me along.
Well, and I think we've heard a lot in this festival about how grieving is a lifelong process. It's not something you do in tidy stages and get over. Sarah, I know that mountain climbing has been the kind of big, wonderful therapy for you. Has there been any other rituals or artistic projects or things you've done that's also helped you with your grief?
No. No, you know, my grief, it took me decades to come to terms with losing my mum. The best years of my life, if you will, you know, in my 20s, my 30s, don't get me wrong, I was still living a full life, but I was always searching. You know, there was an undercurrent of distress and unsettlement. I wasn't a wholly happy person. Just always looking for this sense of peace. And I did, you know, I did get there, and it was mainly through the walking. That was it for me, you know. I mean, I love my art, and my paintings and writing are, you know, they're kind of similar in a way. They make me feel elation when it's going well and despair when it's not going so well. You know, I could spend like hours mulling over the wording of just one or two sentences when I'm writing. Or equally, you know, I find it very difficult to express or convey a feeling with my brushwork when I'm working on canvas. So both, you know, they can have me in the depths of despair or complete satisfaction, and I actually experience those swings of feelings when I'm out walking as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the triple threat. It's writing, painting, and walking for
Wow.
me.
That's I think that's fascinating. Well, you'll have to carry on walking then. So I think we're just about out of time. I found this really fascinating. I love all three of your books. I think they show us really different pictures of the way grief can operate, nature can operate in the grieving process. And I think it shows you that nature is not one thing, you know, that it can offer different things to different people. And, you know, it can release memories, it can distract, and it can absorb you. So I just want to finish really by thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you for sharing your stories today. Do go out and buy their books. And if you're listening to, if you're attending the festival, I hope you enjoy other activities and events for the rest of the day. So thank you very much, and bye for now.
Thank you.